So the webinar today is titled A Comprehensive System for Capital Campaign or Facilities Planning. And we are very excited to have the 4 pillars with us, 4 individuals, all experts in their own field, come together to help with the concept of comprehensive capital campaign.
But tell me, forgive me for my technological restraints, but are you now seeing our opening slide?
It is there. Yes, we're seeing our first slide. Thank you so much for getting that started for us, Dennis.
Okay, so now, next question, are you now seeing our second slide?
Indeed. This is the agenda for today.
Okay,
So,
great.
like I said, we've got a lot to cover. We're going to cover strategic planning, vision, consensus, priorities, financial modeling phases, loan capacity, best practices, talking about design, master planning, architect, and finally the fundraising, stewardship, averages, multiple campaigns, planned giving. And I'm going to turn it over now to our 4 experts so they can get started.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So this webinar is sponsored by Church Development. Our mission is to increase generosity without fundraising, and we've helped hundreds of churches in the past 30 years, and it has been an absolute pleasure. And the greatest pleasure has really arrived in the last year when I have met Charity, Randy, and Jennifer as we are now volunteers in the 4 Pillars Collaborative, where we decided to volunteer to offer our services for free to churches who are beginning to get organized and prepare for a major facilities effort. And that's given us the resources to really equip and prevent lots of failure. Now, this is my brief resume. I've been around forever. There's the one benefit of being old is that you've got experience. So I've seen lots of churches go through the process, as have my co-volunteers. None of them are as old as me, but they're all more experienced than me and probably smarter as well. So the information that I will bring to this, I'll ask each of my co-presenters to review their resume as well. But I've raised around $1 billion, and I'm a bit of an absent-minded professor. I constantly have numbers and ratios flowing through my brain. And I study a lot of what works in the secular world and in the corporate sector. And I'll be bringing that to you when I share my information. And I've been members of professional associations like the International Catholic Stewardship Council, the National Association of Church Business Administrators, which is now called the Church Network, the Planned Giving Council. My graduate studies were in this field, and I have my academic research published in the International Journal of Innovation. And it's fun to be able to share these resources with you all. For me, myself, my inspiration comes because of my relationship with God. I've had 3 miracles in my life. The first one you see at the top, I had a gun to my head in Angola, and for some reason God spared my life, and that facilitated a shift in my thinking. Instead of all about me, I began to think of what can I do in partnership with God to make the world a better place. And there was a miracle the way I met my wife. I bought a t-shirt from her at a golf tournament, and then I met her brother about a year later and said, I remember you from when we were kids. I remember the time Jenny was 6 years old. She was on the high dive. She slipped and fell, and as you put your hands on the ladder to go up the high dive, you caught her. We both looked at each other like, holy smokes, that was 22 years earlier. And then the third miracle is you see this little girl doing a cartwheel. That's how I discovered I had cancer. My daughter was doing a cartwheel through the dining room and delivered a kung fu accidental kick at 100 miles an hour. I go to the doctor. He says, well, she didn't break anything, but she kicked you in the tumor. You have cancer. So these things, are they random or are they the hand of God? I feel like I have a good relationship with God, and it allows me to boldly serve the church and not in any shy way proclaim what we're all about. And it's really been a fun career these past 30 years. We're based in Scripture. 1 Peter 4:10 is my favorite. We're all blessed with something different. It's up to us to figure out how to best use that to serve our fellow human beings in pursuing and implementing the gospel. So we're a little different from other church capital campaign firms. The ask is based in prayer and not pressure. And annual giving goes up, and planned giving goes up as well. I really like the 4 Pillars Collaborative. This is a new thing in my life this past year, and it's just been a joy. So you can read that mission statement right there. And I have to thank Jennifer Gutierrez, who is a very experienced visioning facilitator, and she led us through this process very competently. And I like this because it says what we're all about. We're all about serving the church in this collaborative way, and it's expertise. And you're going to get the benefit of billions of dollars of expertise in the next 40 minutes. Feel free to ask questions, put them in the chat box. I'll make sure that we address those. So in my history, and my co-workers will testify to this as well, most churches pursue a new facility in a very fragmented approach. These 4 parts are the critical parts in making a successful facilities change in the life of the church. The most common problem is that a church will go directly to an architect and say, build us the Taj Mahal, without involving someone like Charity, who is a financial planner, or me, a fundraiser, or a Jennifer, who understands how important it is to get consensus around the vision, or even somebody like Randy, who has built many, many churches. So rather than that fragmented approach, the collaborative approach allows us to have lots of dialogue, multiple iterations of a plan. And we're going to give you a couple of sample plans of churches to illustrate how important it is to have that collaborative approach. Now, to begin this process, I'd like you to start thinking about where are you in the process. And I suspect because you are here, you're at that first box on the left. You've got to begin with the visioning. What does it look like? And that is really a facilitated process. And to begin that dialogue, I'd like to ask Jennifer Gutierrez of JAG Consulting to share a little bit about herself and also to talk about the right way to proceed. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And it's such a pleasure to spend this time with all of you this morning. Thank you. We know that your time is precious working for the church, and that you spend 24/7 working for the faithful, building your faith, spending time with the people closest to you, and you never stop thinking about it. So a little bit about JAG Consulting. This might not be as dramatic as Dennis's introduction, but JAG Consulting has existed for over 20 years. Our team provides basically the services to help you develop your vision, what your purpose is, and then the plan to go along with that, so you can achieve those goals with the people that you work with every day, and you can see the results. For about 15 years, JAG Consulting served corporate, public affairs, and nonprofit clients, and then about almost 8 years ago, we decided to switch over and serve faith-based organizations, dioceses, churches, universities, charities, foundations, and so on. And we just never looked back. And so it's just such a pleasure to be with you today and to talk to you a little bit about that visioning process. So what comes before building your church? A vision is an image in words of what success looks like to you. And it's more than just, as you know, it's more than just the church building. It has to do with what you see in your mind's eye about how that will be used. How many children are going to be running through the lobby area? How many people are going to be seated in worship or in mass? What kinds of activities? How will the baptisms work? How do you want people to feel when they walk in the door? That's all part of that vision. So it paints a picture of what that victory looks like in your mind, and it combines that picture with what's in everybody else's minds on your leadership team, on your building team, so that you draw consensus around what that vision looks like, what it feels like, what you want it to feel like, what you want your church to feel like 5 or 10 or 20 years down the road. So it really is painting that picture of where you're headed tomorrow. So again, talking about vision, our process builds consensus. It really builds that single line to where you want to be with the church. Now, consensus doesn't always mean that everybody agrees on everything. What it does mean is that everybody agrees on that direction. They agree on that vision. So the first part of building consensus is talking about the vision. It's talking about, what are you seeing? What are people talking about? What are you hearing people say about your church? And then building consensus around what that vision is for your church, and also being able to communicate that to the people that attend your church. The next piece after vision is purpose, and purpose has to do with that statement of mission. You know, why do you exist? Why are you there? And then priorities. The last part of this process is really building that plan around those priorities and determining what the top 3 or 4 things are that you'd like to start with, and how you'll measure when you get there. So we talked a little bit about vision. Purpose, there are really 3 pieces of purpose. It's why you exist. And I want you to take a moment, just a second, to think about why does your church exist? What is it there for? What's the first thing that comes to mind? It might seem obvious, but think about that for a minute. Then who is your target audience? Now, you know, for a church, your target audience might be, of course, the parishioners, but you think about, you know, what are the demographic ages of the people in your church or your parish? How many will there be in each of those demographic areas 5 or 10 years from now? Will there be some Spanish speaking people in your church 10 years from now? So think about who your target audience is. And then lastly, how your church will serve your target audience through worship services, through mass, through ministries. So those 3 pieces are all integral to what your purpose is that goes beyond that vision.
Hey, Jennifer, I just had a question pop up in the chat box. How long does it take you as a facilitator to work a church through this purpose and vision process?
That's a great question. So typically it takes just 1 day. We have some communication ahead of time, but basically it's a 1-day facilitated session to really work through the vision and the purpose and consensus on those 2 areas, which is whoever asked that question, that's a wonderful segue to the next slide, because I want to talk about then what comes next. Great question. So next we talk about those priorities, and a lot of people look at priorities, they look at them in the context of a strategic plan or an action plan. What's the difference? And the difference is that because this is a building process, this isn't necessarily a comprehensive strategic planning process that many of you might have been through in your companies or your organizations. We determine what that action plan is and those priorities are to get you to the next step. So while a visioning and a purpose, a missioning session would take about a day, then your church would determine maybe a half day, if a half day or a full day session is necessary to develop that action plan. For example, a 1-year action plan to talk about what comes every single month of this next year. Or maybe you want to do a 3-year plan where you have broad goals for those 3 years, but then we develop a tailored 1-year action plan for your church. So basically in that planning process, we determine what those priorities are, again, constantly going back to the vision and the purpose. And then those lead into the amazing work then that Randy does with you in the design phase, and Dennis does with you in the fundraising phase, and Charity does with you in the financing phase, so that it can guide every single step of the path to building your church.
All right, Jennifer, I have another question for you out of the chat box. Who else do you involve besides the pastor in this planning process?
That's a great question. So typically there's a leadership team, Dennis, that is designated maybe by, sometimes it's a pastoral council or a church council or a parish council, but we have that conversation about who the right people would be to be part of that process. Typically, I recommend that no more than 15 people are part of that actual session. However, there can be a research or a survey process ahead of time to gain the feedback of stakeholders prior to that planning session, so that it can best inform that group of 10 to 15 people.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. So I've got other questions that popped up, but I want to shift to Charity, and then I'd like to come back. Can I come back to you in a little bit to ask another question? Okay, great. So this is Jennifer's contact information. If you're watching this show or this webinar right now, I will send you these slides. So you'll have her contact information if you'd like to ask her questions. Now, next, I'd like to ask Charity Keene if she would talk about religious organization financing. And before I do that, I want to say thank you, Charity, for the information that you sent me. It was either yesterday or the day before, about that church in Atlanta, about their expectation of a down payment and those terms. You blew their mind and made their day.
Hey.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, I could not, I didn't know that. I couldn't have shared that, but your many years of expertise was just a fantastic blessing about a church I've been working with for a really long time, and your information was a total game changer. So anyway, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I'm glad that it was helpful. So, well, I'm going to start out and just give you a real quick intro on me and on Emanate Consulting, and even a little bit on UBT. So I work for a bank as my, I guess, main job. I work for a bank in Nebraska that does religious financing all over the country. So that's kind of how I fit into this piece to start with. Within that role, I also wear a second hat as a financial consultant for churches in a company called Emanate Consulting. And what I do with Emanate is help churches find financing and get organized for financing, because over the time that I have been a church lender, which is more years than I really want to talk about, a while, and lending to churches all over the country, I learned a lot about that prep time for churches and how important it is to have your information in a way that a bank is going to be able to understand. So I've done financing for hundreds of millions of dollars worth of projects over the years, and learned a lot of key factors in how churches need to be behaving and organizing prior to getting funding. So what I do when we work together as a collaborative is really consult with you as a church prior to you actually going to a bank to ask for financing, because there are some things that need to happen that you need to have in line. And one of the things that I say, and I'm sure that this collaborative group is sick of me saying it because they hear it all the time, but bankers speak their own language, literally. They use acronyms, they say words that no one else uses. So when a bank and a church who kind of also speaks their own language try to get together and communicate about financial needs, it's two different languages. So how I fit into that picture is that I both have a background in church and in lending, and I can be that interpreter between the two groups to make sure that everybody's on the same page to be successful in finding good financing options for your church with good rates, good terms, not just something that you have to have and you have to accept because there's no other choice. So in order to reach that goal, to be able to find a good financing package, it's important to note, and I think this will kind of be a theme, that the other pieces of the collaborative also really need to be in place, because being able to find good financing also means you've got a vision, you have a plan, your architectural person and team is in the same mindset as your financing team, as well as your campaign team. So just, we'll probably hammer on that we all have to work together in order for this to really work well. That being said, I have a slide here that talks a little bit about some of the basics. And I just, I'm not going to go through every little detail because I know you'll get these slides, but there's a couple things that I just kind of want to hit on. One thing, and this is probably, Dennis is raising his hand.
Yeah, I got a question that popped up in the chat box, and it is, would you say that church financing is a specialty, just like commercial lending or industrial lending would be a specialty?
I would say 100%. One of the things that I would like everybody to take away from this, and anytime I talk with churches, the most important thing that you need to have in a lender, whether it's a bank, a credit union, a foundation, is somebody who understands you as a church, not just a general lender. I mean, there's good general lenders, but if you can find somebody who understands church lending, you're going to be heads and tails above anybody else, because there's different things that we look at, and we'll talk a little bit about that. A banker who doesn't understand church is going to try to make you fit into a box that you don't fit in, and it'll be difficult for them to get an approval because they don't really know what they're supposed to be looking at, and then they can't get comfortable because they don't really know what they're looking at. So I think that's the most important thing, is to have somebody who has a specialty in church financing. And there's great church financing lenders in all different aspects of, different places in the United States, national lenders, not just Union Bank, which is the cool thing about what I get to do with Emanate, because I can talk with all of those lenders and give you options far and beyond just the bank that I also represent. So great question. Okay, so some of the basics. One of the biggest things that trips up a church when they're going to get financing is that their financial statements are perfectly understandable to the person who's been doing them for the last 15 years, because it's probably a volunteer and everything makes sense within the church. But when you hand those over to a financial institution, they can't decipher them. They don't understand your system. Maybe we didn't track depreciation over the years, they're company prepared. So what I do is help you get your financial statements in a way organized in a professional manner. And whether it's me or it's someone in your church, you need to have professional looking financial statements if you're going to ask a bank to give you money. So very, very important. And then just understanding the numbers that they're going to want to talk about. What's a giving unit? Well, you need to kind of know what that is. You need to know what your church giving units look like. You need to be able to understand the history of your giving. And then projected budgets. What's the next year going to look like? And if you've already done some of the visioning and planning with Jennifer, you have a 5-year and a maybe longer picture of where you want to be, how much you want to grow, those kind of things. So you can provide that information to the bank. Once you have all of that information and you've really dug into it, being able to answer any questions that might come up that look a little different, being able to fully explain anything within your finances that's maybe unusual is really important, because in my experience, once a bank or a lending committee that's going to approve a church loan goes down a curve because of something that's unusual, it's difficult to get them to turn around and look back at what is really happening. So having all that stuff up front is really, really important. Another thing I want to just point out is that there are more costs to this than just the building budget. So be sure you understand everything that's involved. The next piece that I'm going to throw up here, and thank you, Dennis, for moving us on to ratios. These are across the board, most of the ratios that a bank or a credit union is going to look at when they're determining whether you can get a loan and how much you can get. This is just kind of laying it all out there for you. These are the ratios that, it tells you exactly what you need to look at. How much is your principal and interest payments going to be on this loan, and how much of each giving unit is going to have to, how much will they have to pay? $500 or less is a good benchmark. How much of a loan can we get? Well, this is my favorite one because it's the easiest for you to really go out there and say, this is a good benchmark. 4 times your annual giving is most likely going to be your top loan amount. Now, there's all kinds of exceptions. If you have a great big campaign, you have a good pile of cash that you're putting in on your building project, so your loan to debt is going to be, or your debt to the project cost is going to be very low. So there's some things that can change this, but it's still a good starting benchmark for you to determine how much you can borrow. The other ratios are, pretty self-explanatory. The other one ratio I want to point out that I like, because I think people relate to it, because when you go buy your house, bank oftentimes will say your debt to your annual income can only be 35 or 40% or whatever it is. In church lending, we don't want your loan payment to be more than 30% of your budget next year. So that's a very nice, easy number to calculate to kind of figure out what you can afford.
Okay, I've got another question that just popped up in the Q&A box. You can use that too if you hover your cursor over that little green stripe, the bottom right-hand corner. It's a cute question. Can I call and talk to you for free?
Yes, you can call and talk to me for free. I do a lot of that, actually. When Emanate services really kick in is once you have talked to us, kind of given me the scope of what you're looking for, and then you say, help me find a loan, help me get to the next stage. We want to get prepared. Then we can talk about going from there. But just calling and asking questions, even running your numbers by me so that I can tell you, yeah, you're in the ballpark, or yeah, we got some work to do. I do that all the time. So certainly.
All right, great. Last question, kind of like Jennifer's question. How much time does it take from beginning to end contacting you to arrange a loan on a church facility project?
That's a great question with a lot of different answers. So it really depends on how the rest of the pieces of this, how far along you are. If you are starting from scratch and working with the 4 of us all together, it's going to take a little bit of time because you'll have to develop where you're going to go, what's the project look like. If for some reason you're all of those pieces were already done and you came to me and said, help me find a loan, we're ready to go. I usually tell a church that it's going to be about 8 weeks from the time that you provide me all the information to the time that we are ready to close and fund. That's really hard to nail down if it's a building project, because those pieces, you just don't know how long some of that stuff is going to take, but that gives you a general idea.
Well, that's fantastic. So I'm hearing there are so many moving parts, so many variables that the time constraint might be different depending on different circumstances. But I really liked your concluding comment of, if you've got collaborative experts like the folks who are doing this presentation, that's just going to be a lot easier. It's like a transmission that's well lubricated. The gears are going to connect and function.
Absolutely. And it's just going to make your options for financing so much better because the pieces are already all in place. So.
Yeah, I mean, just like that church in Atlanta, their minds were boggled. I mean, for them, for you, I'm sure it was an obvious thing, but for them and for me, I've been through a lot of this. I didn't know that. So thank you again for that. And thank you for being here today. All right, now let me shift gear to Randy. our architect. And Randy, thank you for coming. I remember the first time Randy blew my mind is when he said, in designing a new church, the foyer ought to be 1/3 the space required for the worship space. And I thought, my goodness, that seems like a lot. But then I think about the church when we went through our renovation, 20 years ago, the former foyer was right about the size of a phone booth, and it was worthless. And I think of how, I'm kind of a social animal. It's fun to interact with my friends from church. We'd have to stand outside, and what if it's raining or snowing? Then I would kind of miss interacting with my friends. So Randy, thank you so much for being here today. And I want to thank you for your work on St. Augustine's, where we met so long ago. That was one of our most successful capital campaigns, raising 4 times annual giving, and they're about to go in their 4th year extension. So I think they'll end up being about 4.5 times annual giving. And I think you should get some of that credit because you have such a wonderfully engaging process in church design. But take it away, Randy.
Well, thank you, Dennis. So as Dennis said, I'm an architect that almost 30 years now have specialized in worship environments and working with faith communities beyond just the worship component of their facilities. So I was thinking about this a little bit. If you've tried just calling randomly an architect to work on your church project, you might get, which I've heard even in my own area, a donation to your cause in the name of your competitor, rather than taking on the job, because as Charity said, working with the church is a little different. Now, I grew up, my dad was a pastor, so I'm used to doing those kind of committee meetings at churches at night and weekends and whatnot, right? So the fellowship of that is wonderful, but it's sometimes hard for architects to get their brains around in working, because it's a very collaborative approach. It's your second home, and it's your second family. And so everybody in the church wants to be involved in ultimately what I say below, what will it look like and what will it cost, right? It's kind of where the rubber meets the road in this process. But really, it is still about process, because the building, the architecture, is kind of a wrapper for your ministries, your programs, and we've said it before, faithful people need a beautiful place to gather to do the work that God's given to them and to worship. And so that's the approach we take. And maybe if we jump into the slides a little bit, it really needs a good process and the involvement of a lot of different people in order for this to be successful. So here's a diagram that there are various components to that. Along the bottom, there is kind of these blue arrows that say there's a planning piece, and that's a lot about what we're talking about today, is the strategic visioning, the programming, the conceptual design, what it's going to look like. And then there's kind of making certain your finances fit that dream, that the dream is fulfilling your ministry, so that we can go through the steps of implementing, or actually designing and building an addition or a renovation or a new church, as you might see it. Now, we love involvement from as many people in the church as the church is comfortable with. So I've designed churches with a pastor and 4 deacons, and at St. Augustine, which is the church Dennis mentioned, we actually started with a workshop that we invited everybody in the church to come for a Saturday and give us input and roll up their sleeves and do some of the design work with us. The importance of that is what I'm trying to show in this diagram. Your involvement, your influence is the most critical early in the project, because as we all know, as we move forward, if we don't make the right decisions, the cost of changing your mind or changing the project grows. And actually, it's not that nice little triangle. It really grows exponentially, right? So the architect working with you needs to understand that we've got to answer certain questions so that we can control the cost of construction and get you that beautiful space. So Dennis, if you take me to the next slide. Another way of looking at this, and I realize the text is a little bit small on the screen, But that planning phase usually takes about 3 to 4 months. There might be 5 or 6 different work sessions. I've kind of outlined here that once you start working with the architecture piece of this, we would want to organize who all would be involved, just as Jennifer talked about. There's a right amount of people that will help the process move quickly. So we need to determine that. We need to figure out a communication process so that the entire faith community knows what's going on and give them opportunity for input. So we typically go through these steps of getting immersed in your faith community, figuring out what we call discovery of needs, all of the actual nitty gritty, how many rooms for Sunday school, why, and what's the amount of children that might be in there. Bring all of our expertise. I've done maybe 50 or 60 churches, between 50 and 60 churches now in my career, and I know there's some of that we can bring to your discussion that help you right size how much you actually need to build, so your wants and your needs come together. We're going to take that, we're going to put that into a written program that identifies all the spaces, and then we're going to do what architects do, what you think of architects doing, and that's developing site plans and drawings of how this would go together, and ultimately what it would look like and what it would cost in order to start raising the money or borrowing the money for implementing the project. I'm going to return to that implementing the project just a minute, but if we move forward for the sake of time, Dennis, the next slide. So I'm going to give you an example because I find this is the best way to understand it. We worked with the church, First Lutheran Church, not too long ago, and how all of this started, it actually started with what Jennifer talked to you about. They had their vision statement, and they had a new pastor, and the pastor had that vision statement printed on the wall in their gathering space. And he was standing there proudly looking at it. And a young boy in the congregation was standing next to him and started reading it. And he said, we say we're a welcoming church. We don't really mean that, do we? And the pastor started talking to him and said, well, what do you mean? We don't mean that. And just from the mouth of babes, right? The boy kind of pointed out that they say those things, but what were they actually doing? So they went back, they did a visioning, and then they took it further than just the statement to provide a facility that is accessible to all and a worship space that is adequate in terms of theology, aesthetics, and functionality. And they put some practical objectives with that. Those were the things that they handed off to us to then make that reality, right? And so very important that they use that as their guiding approach throughout the entire process till when the church was dedicated. So next slide. So part of what we did was we created, and we use this word roadmap in a lot of different ways, but we typically show a congregation how to maximize their site, existing site or a new site. So way beyond what they think they're going to do in the moment, so that they're thinking about 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, in terms of not pie in the sky, but just as your ministry might expand or your facility might expand, what's a good place for everything to occur so that you don't build in the wrong place and shorten the amount of time you're at that site. So we did that. This plan color-coded showed all of the areas we were touching. Some of them were additions, some of them were renovations. And then we went through and identified those different items in terms of cost to implement. And the critical thing here is, without charity being involved in that approach, most churches would just say, well, we think we need to do this and we have no idea what it's going to cost, but let's go ahead and design it and let's see what we can raise. Well, that can lead, honestly, that can lead to failure, right? Because you can, if you don't kind of have an understanding of how you get to the end point with what you can afford and what it's going to cost, which I can bring to the table, you can run into dead ends. So we don't want the congregation to be discouraged for their dreaming and for their giving and input. And so it's good to right size what you can afford to do with the plan. So putting multiple steps into it is typically how we would approach it, and see how many of those steps are items they can accomplish. So next slide. So I'm just going to show you real quickly. This was the church beforehand, and a big concern was it's kind of interesting looking structure. Didn't particularly look welcoming to people who might be driving by. It was kind of stern and not a lot of windows. So in working through that plan and all of those talking points and statements of what they wanted to be, we developed a vision, which we'll show you here, which was all about remaking the front entryway so that it had 0 step, that people with disabilities could actually get into the building without assistance, that it was very transparent, and that it checked the boxes on all of the things they said they wanted it to be. So this is what we presented to the congregation along with costs. And then they went about the business of figuring out what they could afford, what they had, what they needed to borrow versus what they could raise. They reached that point, and then I mentioned I would come back to this. So implementing has its own set of phases and an enormous amount of work. So typically we would work with a steering committee that maybe morphs into a building committee, and we would work through all of the design and how you're going to build it, how you're going to work with the contractor. There's a lot of different ways to do that, and many steps and an enormous amount of detail to get there. So this, once you decide you're ready to build something, it's probably going to take about, again, 4 to 6 months of design time with engineers and architects, and a year to 2 years typically, depends on the complexity of the project. So you got a couple years of time before you're celebrating in your new space. So it takes some dedication. And then this is the example of just finished during our kind of COVID period. We finished the construction. This is, we met the vision of what that looked like. And I'm not going to show you all aspects of it, but it's very important, the before and the after that we show in the case for renovation, and to get people inspired and what it looks like today. So one example of how that would work, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dennis for continuing discussion of how we get that stewardship in place.
So one of my highlights of just the past year, coming out of COVID, just this past Sunday, I went to a church in Blue Springs, Missouri. And it's the first time I'd been there. I'd been to their old church many, many years ago, and it was kind of like my boyhood church, where it was sort of stifled. And then they moved to this new facility just several years ago, and it has this open feel like you're presenting in this after picture. And I know I'm a little bit of a weird person, but I just had this sense that openness really affects me, how I feel. The worship experience was fantastic, just incredibly good music and a great sermon. And the pastor was really quite funny, and they served us lunch afterward. It was the most delicious almond joy bar I've ever had. But I hope I'm not the only person. When you design, that's one of your goals, isn't it? Really to influence the worship experience on the micro level. Am I right?
Absolutely. And to make it as available to as many different people from their different walks of life and abilities, disabilities, so that they're concentrating on loving God and loving their neighbor, not worrying about getting up steps or whether the lighting or the sound is good enough or any of those things.
Okay, one last question before we shift over to fundraising. Do you feel like the shift towards changing one's worship space to accommodate audio, visual, and broadcasting is here to stay?
I would say yes, although within the full range of communities we work with, some, and it is not dependent on size, so it doesn't matter how large or small it is, although larger communities are a little more dependent on audiovisual. I mean, they're really mega-sized churches, but it depends on how that community wants to worship. So we do work with some churches that they understand kind of the sound reinforcement piece, or if you have a hearing disability, but they are really focused in the moment without audio. But even in those churches, they may have a message that they want to share after the service, or as part of the service, or if it's fully integrated, yes, we're more electronic, less reliant on hymnals or mislets or books, and more the ability to respond in the moment. We just need to make that feel integrated in the worship environment so it doesn't take the place of or feel like it's pushing aside the aesthetic or the sensibility that you're comfortable with. But definitely here to stay, and for a good reason, because it allows more people to be really engaged in worship, I feel.
And that's the most important thing. All right, thanks, Randy. So let me leap into the fundraising part, church capital campaigns. And Jennifer and Randy and Charity, I would welcome you to interrupt me with questions as we go, as I have interrupted you. I appreciate your responses. And I already introduced myself earlier, and now you know I'm very old. I have a ton of experience. I've made every mistake that you can make, hopefully, like Chuck Norris's advice for success, which was, my son reminds me, first figure out what doesn't work and then don't do that. That's good sound advice. So I've narrowed it down to what works. And what I have discovered is that a typical church capital campaign, if you average out our last 100 churches, we've raised about 2.5 times annual giving and 3-year pledges. The St. Augustine's that Randy and I worked together on, that was 4 times annual giving, and with the 4th year extension that doesn't cost anything, it'll probably end up being 4.5. And they might choose to do a subsequent campaign. They might. In a big project, doing 2 consecutive capital campaigns is the norm. Pleasant Valley Baptist Church, I managed their 7th campaign in 21 years. So some churches are a little more robust in their fundraising. I remember, I'm a nerd for ratios. I remember the previous 6 capital campaigns at Pleasant Valley Baptist raised 1.1 times annual giving and 3-year pledges. And we raised 1.5 times annual giving and 3-year pledges. So we had about a 40% increase just based on our facilitative, collaborative, prayer-based approach. So we do have some apples to apples comparisons. If you do a second capital campaign, it's more work and you'll probably raise less money. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. However, annual giving and planned giving does increase during a capital campaign. It increases because we see ourselves kind of like farmers. It increases because we work at it, and you have got to plant those seeds. I remember at Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church, I was on, we were the facilitators for their campaign. I was at a prayer team meeting, and one of the leaders of the prayer team said, "I'm ready to make my pledge. I'm going to give $100 a month." And my response was, "Well, thank you so much for your generosity." And then I said, Commitment Sunday is really 2 months from now. So there's not a big rush. We still have that very important component of collaborative prayer that will precede any of us making commitments. So thank you. And I'm getting ready for that time of prayer. But tell me about the rest of your life. How are you? And she responded, horrible. She said, I have 8 rental homes, and one of them needs a roof. It needs siding. It needs paint on the inside. I just don't like it. It's a real pain. And being the bloodthirsty shark that I am, I said, well, perhaps that could be your gift to the church capital campaign. You wouldn't have to put a new roof, paint, siding, or anything, and you'd get a fantastic tax deduction you might be able to spread out over the next 5 years. She said, that's a great idea. So she went from being a donor of $3,600 to $360,000, which made me very happy. And that happens when you plant that seeds. Those things are entirely possible. The main thing that we try to do is to avoid surprises and avoid disasters. So we want to engage everybody way in advance. That's why we want somebody like Jennifer early on for consensus building and information gathering. so people know what's going on. A real important part of the fundraising is the social proof. So we want people involved in the capital campaign. We want as many people as possible. Gallup Polling created an instrument called the ME25 to really assess where you are in terms of engagement. And the typical church, unfortunately, only has about 15% of the people that are fully on board, which means they attend, they volunteer, and they give. So the church is changing before our eyes, and we have really got to figure out a way to accommodate the other 85%. Among that 15%, only a third of them, or only 5% of the average church actually tithes 10%. Most of us give around the 2% level, so we know we've got a lot of room to grow. It really does help to take a professional approach. We keep track of do-it-yourself churches, and the average do-it-yourself capital campaign raises about 50% of annual giving and 3-year pledges. And it's conceivable that you could raise 3 times annual giving or 4 or 5 times. Recently, we had a church in Prairie Village where we raised 7 times annual giving. The better job you do with the farming activities of a campaign, the more funds you will raise. Here is a possible church project plan summary. This is just a church I met with on Monday night, and they're early on in the process, and I'm suggesting that they employ a Jennifer Gutierrez just right away to build consensus around the vision and the priorities. Then I'm suggesting they get somebody like Charity to help them think through their financial plan. For this church, they know they can borrow up to 400% of annual giving, which for them equates to about 1.4 million. I've told them I think you could probably raise 2.5 times annual giving. That's 875. So right away, you begin to see this possible scope of this project might be around 1.2. That's entirely possible. And if there's debt, they could do a second campaign. As we laid out the steps, I said that after you've done those initial steps, then you would do a feasibility study where you ask everybody for their input, and you are straight up, just transparent as you can be. Say, we're thinking about doing a capital campaign. What do you think? How do you feel? Would you volunteer? What do you know about the plans? What are your concerns? We ask about 20 questions, and one of them is the money question. If we were to have a campaign tomorrow, what amount would you consider giving? Because it is anonymous, people are very direct with us. And if there is a problem, they tell us. It is just like an X-ray before surgery. Not long ago, we did a feasibility study at a church that had a $4 million budget. And then when it came time to present the feasibility study results, they got very angry with me because we recommended that they not do a capital campaign. They had some serious conflict going on. I have 4 children, so you know my life is total chaos, and it has been for a long time. And getting church on time is a battle every single Sunday. Well, the pastor at this church was upset with people like me who were disorganized, and he locked the doors at 9:59 for the 10 o'clock worship service. And believe it or not, there were a few people who were chaotic and disorganized who did not get there on time. And this was upsetting to some people, and they were more than just a little upset. And he kept doing that kind of thing. And of course he was right. We should be there on time. But my first question wasn't that illegal besides being dangerous and fire code? So we had bigger issues rather than just raising money to renovate. So what ended up happening is we ended up delaying the campaign by about 3 years till we ironed those many issues out. But the feasibility study was just so critical to unveil those. About 90% of the time we have a positive feasibility study result, and we from that are able to forecast fairly precisely how much we can raise and what exactly we have to do. So out of that feasibility study comes a real detailed plan of what a capital campaign might look like. And we get a bunch of volunteers out of it as well. So it's really a very useful diagnostic tool. I've had rotator cuff surgery and Achilles tendon surgery and cancer surgery. So I know how important those X-rays are and MRIs are before you get a surgery. So now I trust that diagnostic activity. So once the feasibility, go ahead, Charity.
There's a couple questions in the question and answer if you want to take a peek at those.
Yeah, those are related questions. I'll go ahead and let you know what they are. They're really the same pretty much questions. What is your thinking about running concurrent campaigns? The main campaign would be from the diocese, and the concurrent campaign would be for a new church and school, parish run. Do they work successfully, or running two separate campaigns work better in your experience? And then the second question from another person is, do congregations get campaign fatigue when you run more than one capital campaign?
Okay, so I'll answer the second one first because it's easy. Yes. And do people campaign? Do they complain? Yes. Will you raise less money? Yes. The key is do a feasibility study and find out to what degree are people fatigued. Like I remember working at Pleasant Valley Baptist, I was scared to death doing their 7th campaign. And remember, I've taken an alligator wrestling class, so I know what fear is. I've done stand-up comedy, which is worse than alligator wrestling. It's really frightening. I was more frightened going into Pleasant Valley Baptist Church for that 7th campaign. But the feasibility study told us people will give and they will give generously. A lot of people said, we are burnt out, we're tired of giving. But then in the next breath, they said, but yes, we think the new wing, the education wing, is extremely important. And yes, I will give. So I have a coworker, Daryl Prater, who's kind of the rock star of church development. He's just so very competent and intelligent and thinks ahead. I'm just so happy he's on our team. And I was working at his church. And I was interviewing a person during the feasibility study, and they were mad at me. They said, we shouldn't do fundraising. He kind of implied I was a scumbag for even asking for money. We should be worshiping in a tent and giving the remaining money to the poor. I said, oh, those are good, pure thoughts, but I disagree. We should have a building and be safe. So anyway, we had lots of, it was very contentious. He was angry at me personally. And then we got around to the money question. And I was kind of afraid to ask it. And he said, well, yeah, I'd give 10,000, but it doesn't. I'm like, really? After all that chewing out? So yes, people might get burnt out, but boy, we will find out if they will give by doing that feasibility study. All right, now let me answer the first question that was asked. And let me tell you a story about a church in Lee Summit, Missouri, where this was the 3rd capital campaign we had done for them over the course of 20 years. And we took a big risk there too. And the feasibility study told us it was okay, but we did a combined campaign for their annual campaign, their capital campaign, and a diocesan, a denominational campaign, all 3 of those. And we got spectacular results. We went over the goal that their denomination had set for them. We raised more than 3 times annual giving in the capital campaign. And annual giving had an increase of 20% of giving, the 20% increase in the number of givers. So can you do those together? Yes. And I was scared to death the first time I did a concurrent campaign. Now I recommend, hey, you ought to think about it. It seems to have a momentum effect. And kind of going back to Jennifer, so many things go back to the strategic planning and consensus building. If people own it, they will implement it. So if a pastor just stands up there and says, when I've seen this happen, I've been in a church where a pastor said this, I have an idea and all y'all need to give money to it. Well, all of us all did give money to it, but it was very modest giving. So we 100% agree, but it was a bunch of $20 gifts. And that was not so good. So the consensus is the important thing. So before I go on down these bullet points, Stephanie, do you have another question that you're about to leap into?
I believe that you answered both of them. Other than I think that's it. Unless you wanted to comment separately about a diocesan campaign versus a parish campaign running at the same time.
Yeah, and I think diocesan campaign and parish campaign is just fine. And the reason why it goes back to Jennifer, there's more dialogue, there's more ownership, there's more discussion. Now, remember, the macroeconomic view is most of us give 1% to 2% of our income. And we know the biblical invitation is to give 10%. Early on in my career, I used to think people who are tithing shouldn't be asked to give more. And boy, was I ever wrong. They're the first ones to sign up. And someday I'll write a book about that. I've written 4 books. And if you would like all this information in a book, I wrote the Stewardship System, How to Increase Generosity Without Fundraising. Send me a note, send me an email. I'll send you the book. My wife accused me of writing the book so that I could read it. And she accuses me of doing webinars like this so that I can watch them. So I think it's a great book, and the stories are funny, but you can be the judge. I'll send it to you for free. Just send us a note. So a lot of that information is in there, but it goes back to the Jennifer phenomenon, where the people are engaged and consensus is happening, that where our sights are lifted from our moribund ways and we become more generous. All right, I know we're approaching the conclusion of our time together, so let me flip ahead. Just in general, if you follow the capital campaign model of church development, which is just based on prayer and not pressure, it's engagement, it's a lot of fun, it's a very social activity, it's a lot of busyness over the course of 4 or 5 months, but it's really very fun. Matter of fact, one of our best references said, and I quote, "We might do this again next year, whether we need the money or not." I said, well, that's a nice testimony. So you will probably raise 3 to 7 times annual giving. Your annual giving will probably go up. You'll probably have a bunch of planned gifts. And I say that because I can't tell you exactly, but it happens to everybody else that we work together. Item B there, you see, here are some examples of recent campaigns that went well. And that's just how things are going. And in particular, this past year, 2020, even though it's been horrid with COVID, our leadership gifts have just been astronomical. And I attribute that to the stock market. So we do spend a lot of time thinking about how to stimulate leadership gifts, non-cash gifts of assets. We spend a lot of work on that. Now, if you don't do this, the consequences are basically you'll raise less money. That's the easiest way to summarize it. So when you plan and conduct a feasibility study, that's, after you've involved literally Jennifer, Charity, Randy, in those initial dialogues, and we've got a first draft together, then you begin this feasibility study. It takes about 6 weeks. It usually costs about $14,000. And it's a 70-page report. You can read it, and when you're done, the insights that you get are the same insights that I get, and you'll see exactly what we have to do. The campaign comes from that feasibility study. This is a sample campaign calendar of activities for another church that I worked through with them. After the consensus on the plan, which is all of the Jennifer, Randy, Charity activities, we identify leadership potential donors and make sure that they are invited to become engaged and involved. And we want to interview some of those folks as well. We engage everybody in episodic volunteer opportunities, which is where a lot of the fun prayer, event, thanks, youth ambassador, and communication teams come in. And that takes a lot of time. I mean, we're the servants of the church to facilitate that high level of engagement. So a volunteer just doesn't serve mashed potatoes or fold and stuff, but they're involved in designing the prayer activities and the thanks activities. I mean, it can be a terrific amount of fun. The high point of the whole campaign is the prayer and discernment time, which precedes Commitment Sunday. And we have, of course, the pastoral staff, and we have a bunch of volunteers, and it's every media that you can think of, from the pulpit to video to texting to social media, in print, in song. So there's no escaping prayer. And the moment a person engages in that discernment process, they automatically become more generous. We make a big deal out of Commitment Sunday because we have discovered half of everyone forgets and doesn't know what's happened. And half the people say, what just happened? What's Commitment Sunday? And we know we got 6. Yes, go ahead.
I do have one more question, and I realize that we're after 12, but the question is, what are the typical fees that you charge? Is 5 cents per 1,000 about correct?
Well, that's a very educated question. If you average all capital campaigns for all nonprofit organizations for the past 100 years, the average cost is 10%. So a business person would say you have to invest $1 to raise 10 to 1 ROI. we are not allowed to charge a percentage. We have kept track of that statistic, and our average is 4%. But again, we don't charge a percentage. We are like an electrician or a plumber, and that we would create a specific proposal for you based on your unique needs with many different options within that. So you could pay us $5,000 and we could just present a workshop and guide you and give you resources. At some churches, we've charged more than $100,000. I remember when we worked at Village Presbyterian Church, that $12 million campaign. I remember because that was the week my oldest daughter was born. It was a big church and it was a big goal, and it was actually more than $100,000. So it's all based on your unique needs, and then you would make those choices as well. All right, so I'll wrap this up. We do 6 weeks of follow up, and then we do 3 years of follow through. And that's where we really want to encourage an increase in weekly giving and an increase in planned giving as well. And I want to conclude by just really reinforcing how important it is to have this collaborative framework, and all those gears have to be intersecting with all of them, all the others at all times, for you to have a successful capital campaign. And if not, the amount of giving goes down, the weekly giving goes down, strife goes up. It is not a happy circumstance, and I have observed many of those. So as I draw to a close, I would like to go back to Jennifer, Charity, and Randy to just offer their 30 seconds of a wrap-up comment before we conclude. And don't forget to remind me, Stephanie, that we'll send these slides out to everybody. Okay. All right, Jennifer, would you like to offer some concluding remarks?
Yes, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. And if you have any questions, you have my contact information. Again, I want to emphasize, for example, Randy had talked about planning and involvement of your faith community in the project. One of the benefits of us. So, for example, in the visioning or in the purpose, because I know what Randy needs and what Charity would need and what Dennis would need and what you need to be successful, that's integrated throughout the process. So you don't feel like you're doing things over and over again. So it's a very streamlined process.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks for your offer for people to contact you as well. Charity, tell me about your concluding comments.
So I'm going to say the same thing. Please feel free to contact me if you have questions and you're trying to figure this out. The financial piece, the one thing that I want to leave everybody with is, don't let this be the last piece. Do your financial planning and assessment early on so that I can help you fit that financial piece into your design and not the other way around, because it's very difficult on your church family, and we've talked about it a little bit on the building committee, to come up with a great, beautiful church and not be able to build it because it doesn't fit within your finances. So, please don't leave that piece of it till the end, because it's very, very important. It's very important that it's integrated through the whole process. And Jennifer's right. She knows what needs to happen, and the same thing for me. I know what needs to happen for the next pieces and how we can help you reach your goals. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And again, please feel free to contact me.
Hey, thanks very much, Charity. That's a good point. Don't wait to start thinking about finances to the end. That was a painful disaster I have personally experienced. Thanks, Charity. So Randy, how about you, my friend? What concluding remarks would you offer?
Yeah, I just like to encourage everybody to enjoy the process that you're considering engaging in. For a lot of the members in the church, this might be the only building project that you're a part of. And while that can be daunting, and we've talked about a lot of what we might call channel markers to help make certain you're going to be successful in this, it's also important just to enjoy each other, enjoy the process, and ultimately to know that God is bigger than all of these things. So we can challenge Him with all of these good thoughts and solid planning, but we can always know that God is bigger than everything we're doing. So have fun, and good luck with all of your endeavors.
Great. Thanks very much, Randy. It's a pleasure having you here, and Charity and Jennifer, thank you so much for joining. I wish I could have had you here in my office that is portrayed behind me. I wish you could have been here. I did cut out the echo chamber part of it. Okay, so one last note before we go. A month from now, May 19th, you're invited to our next webinar, Setting the Stage for a Fall Capital Campaign. Very interesting. Like I told you, this Sunday was a real highlight, going to that church in Blue Springs. It was such a friendly crowd and such pleasant people. And I know a lot of churches, as they reopen and gather back together, there's a pent-up demand for social interaction, and there's a pent-up demand for facility improvements as well. So we'll talk about how you can best serve your congregation, knowing they want to socialize and interact. We'll talk about the trend towards audiovisual improvements. We'll also talk about mini campaigns. If you only need to raise less than 200% of annual giving and don't need to do a full court press, like we've talked about today, there are some tips that you might want to consider. We'll cover stewardship prayers and the discernment process, and we'll have a couple of guest speakers who have been through all that. So until then, I want to say thank you so much. Go forth, good luck, and God bless. Bye-bye.
Dennis, I do have one more thing I'd like to say real quick. First of all, thank you to the 4 pillars, Dennis, Charity, Jennifer, and Randy. Secondly, we will be sending out these slides and the recorded webinar to you. So you'll get those so you don't have to write down everyone's information, and we will upload it to our YouTube channel as well. Thank you all for attending. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks for the reminder, Stephanie. I need you. All right. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.